My name is Abby Smith. I'm a visiting professor of communication and the director of the debate program here at Pepperdine. I am a survivor of violence, of interpersonal violence, and I have spent some time helping to use the skills that I have in public speaking, helping to train survivors of domestic violence in public speaking and advocacy situations.
I'm Rosalind Satchel. I'm an associate professor here at Pepperdine University in communication. I also am an affiliate faculty member in the Social Action and Justice Colloquium. I have about 20 some odd years of experience working to end violence against women in particular and working for the human rights of all groups.
I personally kind of shy away from the term domestic violence because I worry that one of the biggest problems that we have is relating domesticity with the private sphere, and we tend to keep our distance from those issues, right? Like that's something that happens in the home. And so even though that's not necessarily the technical definition of domestic violence, I tend towards interpersonal violence or just partner violence because I think that makes other people feel like they have a bigger stake in the situation.
A lot of scholars are opting to use the term intimate partner violence to denote the violence and abuse that is usually done between partners in a romantic relationship. Those partners can be of the same gender or of different genders, and the violence can be on either part. What we want very much is for churches to understand that there's no such thing as a congregation where domestic violence doesn't happen. The statistics tell us that 1 in every 3 women will be the victim of some form of domestic abuse. And that's whether it's sexual violence, domestic violence, physical violence, economic abuse, financial abuse, or emotional abuse. The latter 3 typically are not criminalized. It depends on the state that you're in. But these are all aspects of domestic violence. What we see in terms of men is that 1 in 6 are typically going to be subject in some way, one of those forms of domestic violence as well. And so if you just stand in any congregation in America, no matter what the faith tradition is, and count off every 3rd or every 6th, you will see who the domestic violence population and victims really look like.
My name is Courtney Job. I was a junior at Pepperdine in the spring of 2014, and I was kind of like, going from church to church, trying to find like a good kind of like, church family, good spot to like go. And I remember it was just post like my December finals, and I went to Lake Avenue, non-denominational in Pasadena, which has great reviews on Google. It's a well-established church, like people know about it. I ended up meeting there a couple that kind of claimed to be missionaries, and they ended up being kind of swindlers. I was in the basement of the church, or in the bottom level of the church, like post-service, and I heard a knock at the door, and there was a couple standing there needing to be let in, so I opened the door and they asked me how to get out of the church like grounds, and it was my first time at the church, so I had no idea. And they looked not like homeless, but they looked like they, kind of down on their luck and needed some help. Did not kind of scream like threatening to me in any kind of way, shape, or form. So I offered to give them a ride from the parking lot to the bus stop, and then kind of like, just because I felt like guilted into it a little bit, I ended up offering them dinner, and then from there it kind of turned into an abusive relationship.
Domestic violence is any abuse, whether that's emotional, psychological, physical or economic, that is done in the context of a relationship in an attempt to control the other person in that relationship.
Both the husband and wife convinced me that like they were people of God, that they were missionaries, and that they were like Paul, going from town to town, kind of like couch surfing and like spreading the word of God and living off people's generosity. By the time that my junior year had finished in the spring of 2014, his wife had actually left him. He was by himself, but he convinced me that it was God's will for me to financially help him in his situation. So I ended up paying for motel rooms, food, grocery store runs. I gave him prepaid Visa cards, like all sorts of things, free rides. I actually was involved in a car accident. I could have taken my life on the 101 freeway headed back from Santa Barbara one night because he demanded that it was God's will for me to take him there right then, right now, right there, right then.
It's also not isolated to heterosexual relationships. It's not isolated to women being the victims. And when you talk about those different groups, there are additional barriers that are created socially that stop them from seeking help that heterosexual women don't encounter, right? So if you're in an LGBTQ plus relationship, then you may have the barrier of like coming out of the closet to your family in order to escape that relationship, who may or may not approve of your relationship. If you're a man, you are subject to different types of ridicule and disbelief, right? Like, how could, a woman do this to you, or you let another man do this to you? And so the psychological barrier of fear that exists for women in heterosexual relationships is magnified, I think, when you're in other types of relationships, and that's not a discussion that we're having a lot.
The majority of victims and survivors are women. There are some men who are also victims and survivors, but the majority are women, and the majority of perpetrators are men. This, in many ways, is a men's problem, but it is often discussed as though it is the burden of the woman to fix, because there are battered women syndromes. There's never a battering man syndrome that we're talking about, right? So we need to deal with what messages men are getting about manhood. And a lot of those messages are coming through our media content. And so when we're looking at some of the prevention issues, part of the prevention mechanisms is looking at our media content, looking at violent forms of masculinity that are being perpetuated through the media and through our institutions. And the media also includes our religious texts, right? So we need to take those difficult scriptures sometimes walk away from the lectionary, sometimes not conform all the way to orthodoxy, that we don't deal with the difficult issues, because there's some difficult texts, even within our religious books, within our Bible, that seem to suggest that violence against women, or violence period, is acceptable. Grappling with those messages and helping people to use a different lens, a different hermeneutic to interpret those scriptures is a big part of prevention as well. We want to definitely help our young men to understand that to be masculine is not to be mean, violent, rude, over-sexual, aggressive. It can mean that you are just caring and loving and kind and understanding, and that you can take no for an answer.
I wish that people knew that it doesn't look like the Lifetime movies most of the time. That if oftentimes it happens slowly over time, like maybe your boyfriend didn't know where you were for a little while, so then he guilts you into letting him have your password to check your phone. Well, that's not really good. I feel like that's probably controlling, but that's only that one thing that he did, right? And then it kind of snowballs over time. Then he asks you if he can, monitor your phone calls with your parents, because like he just wants to make sure you're not saying anything bad about them because he loves you so much. And so I really wish people could expand the scope of their understanding of issues of partner violence, to see it as kind of all harmful mechanisms of control against another human being. And so I think that's important because oftentimes we're dismissive of those cases. We're just like, oh, you have a terrible boyfriend, not like, you have a terrible boyfriend and you need to leave that situation because it's unsafe for you, right? Because it's harming your mental well-being. Even if it's not yet or ever harming your physical well-being, that's still harmful and it's still kind of irreparable damage.
He ended up sexually abusing me one night and then convincing me that he was the man that God wanted me to be with. So then through his manipulation, my brain was already kind of most of the way gone by that point. He was able to like get me to say and do things that were completely out of my character, which had a lot of my family and friends kind of thrown off and puzzling and wondering, you know, what was going on in my life. And so he convinced me to leave Pepperdine. And so ended up moving, out of California and to kind of convince me to stop talking to my family.
I think the statistic, last time I heard it, was you're 7 times more likely to die at the hands of a partner leaving than if you just stay.
I think a lot of people look down on women who stay in abusive relationships and look down on men who stay in abusive relationships because they think that, oh, well, this person's just weak, or this person just can't stand up for themselves, or they're just stupid, or, they're brainwashed, can't help them. In reality, they're probably terrified because they are brainwashed. A lot of people don't even realize they're in an abusive relationship. They may have a hint of it, but not enough to get them to actually take that step to leave. I honestly didn't really realize that I needed to get away from him until about 5 months after he began physically beating me. Once he started doing that, I like to refer to it as the beginning of the end. And even though it took me another year and a half from that time that he started physically abusing me to get out of the relationship, it was that moment when I knew that this was not the right situation for me.
There are a variety of ways that as an institution, Pepperdine and other colleges and universities across the country can take a position. And one of those I think we have to herald is a very courageous position that our president took in declining or giving up the Title IX exemption that we had as a university, as a religious institution. That would have very much protected the university from any sort of problems around sexual harassment, sexual violence, domestic violence, dating violence. It really would have created a bubble, to insulate the university from having to deal with those issues. What our president said is that no, we care about women's issues. We care about these issues. We don't need the exemption because we want very much to stem the tide. We want to change the way that this university stands on these issues, and we're going to stand with victims and survivors for justice.
We don't realize how powerful that trauma written to the brain can be, and I think that's important to think about because it affects our actions, it affects how we engage in future relationships, it affects our ability to sleep, our self-worth, to take care of our overall well-being, to want to go to places such as spiritual help and therapeutic help overall in our lives because we don't recognize where that recurrence of trauma is coming from because it's never been recognized as abuse. And that's scary because as much as domestic violence or interpersonal violence itself is kind of a silent war against the less powerful in our society, I think that specifically the psychological, the spiritual, the mental kind of controlling and abuse is the one that we really don't think about. And no one's wearing a ribbon that's like, did your boyfriend get the password to your phone? If so, you've been a victim of violence, right? But we should be, right? It even elicited a little bit of a giggle from us here in this room because it seems so out of reach, but it actually affects the way we continue on in the rest of our lives. And I think that's really scary.
People have a tendency to think that domestic violence is something that will never happen to them. And that's definitely what I thought. But surprisingly, it can happen to anyone, any, background, any education. And if it does happen to you, it doesn't mean that you're stupid. It just means that you were an unfortunate victim in an unfortunate situation. So, as hard as it is, don't look down on yourself for having dealt with any kind of abusive relationship on any spectrum. And don't look down on others who have gone through a situation such as this, because you never know. That could have been you. It's not something that victims actively participate in. It's something that happens to them.
More so than anything, I'm concerned about the little girls who grow up with very dangerous messages. I volunteer in my son's class on Tuesdays, and I see the ways in which these 6-year-olds, these wonderful, innocent, beautiful, pure 6-year-olds are already being gendered, such that boys feel that they don't cry, they shouldn't cry, such that girls think, that they're just irrational and flaky and goofy, and that's okay, right? That there are dangerous messages that we're giving to our children at a very young age. And when girls think that they automatically have to submit their will to their masculine friend because of his genitalia and the unfortunate circumstance of being a woman, the stuff that we read in 17th century novels that now our young people are still imbibing. And I worry about those messages on these little minds and these little impressionable bodies that have the potential to change the world for good. But if we continue to give them the same messages that we've passed down from century to century to century that have been damaging and harmful and violent, actual violations against us as human beings, not just women, all humanity, that when we pass those messages on to that little 6-year-old girl and that little 6-year-old boy, we're doing the world an incredible disservice, and we're harming them. That in and of itself is violence.